Power Hour with John Lee.
Okay, welcome back to the Power Hour. I'm John Lee. Plenty of power in the hour today. I was just laughing. My mate Omar sticking his face in front of the camera. Very humorous. So today we're talking about the global underworld. Boom. What's that? Well, when we think about the underworld, we think about crime. No, we think about criminal gangs and organisations. But is that really the structure of it? Is it totally amorphous? Or does it have pillars? Is it organised? Well, if it's organised, that implies a conspiracy, doesn't it? And as we know, conspiracy theory is a synonym these days of fantasy, so it can't be true. And if you want to find that out, you can go to Wikipedia, where they'll tell you in the first paragraph that everything's a conspiracy theory if it points at anyone in a uniform or a tie. So we're looking at absolutely documented, proven cases of global machinations, of a global underworld, and trying to connect it all together to show how the structure functions, at least on one level. Because it is like Dante's, seven, I think he had 7 levels of hell, or whatever it was, circles, I think. A bit like that. And a lot of it goes through the USA purely because the USA is such an important, fundamental country in the world. Nothing to do with the people of the United States of America. It's just the mechanisms of power on a global level tend to go through America at some point. So I'm not interested in party politics. You say Republicans and Democrats, and I hear Republicans and Demotwats. I'm not persuaded that they're different at all. I don't think the president's in charge. I think he's got some responsibility, but he's not the boss. Can't say, right, we're stopping the wars. We're just going to stop bombing people because I said so. It doesn't work like that. Too much money on the table. So when it start, really, I suppose it kicks off in 1980. Just this little section of it I'm talking about, but of course the tentacles go all around the world and all around time. But we're beginning about 1979, 1980 with the transition from Jimmy Carter to Ronald Reagan. And Big Ronnie becomes the President of the United States. He was an actor, if you didn't know. Yeah, he was a B-list actor for a long time. And then became the President, which is quite fitting, really, because that's what the President is, in my opinion, a B-list actor. So what's the Iran-Contra scandal? What happened with that? Right, well, you kind of have to mention Jimmy Carter. It happened after Jimmy Carter, but the seeds were sown by Jimmy Carter because he arrived, and I think Jimmy Carter might have been one of the few good men, And he got into the White House and immediately fired 800 CIA agents. Remember that it was only about 15 years before this that Kennedy promised to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces. So now you're told about the intelligence community and how much you have to respect them. Well, Kennedy wanted to smash that into 1,000 pieces. Jimmy Carter fired 800 CIA agents immediately because they were all corrupt, which generated 800 enemies for Jimmy Carter, not your ordinary enemies. These are super spies, very, very clever and not happy with you. So you don't want 800 enemies of that type. And there were some hostages in Iran. The numbers vary, but we'll say 50 hostages. And during the election, Jimmy Carter was trying to get these hostages out. And by all accounts, people backing Reagan, people who were on Reagan's team, or Reagan was on their team, spoke to the Iranians and made a deal. Don't let them out until Reagan gets in. Don't give those points to Jimmy Carter so we can win the election. And then we'll do a deal. And that is exactly what happened, because literally 5 minutes after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, they released the hostages on the other side of the world, and they got out the same day as Ronald Reagan got in. And of course, Wikipedia will tell you that's a conspiracy theory, even though it's absolutely obvious. So after that, in the 80s, the Americans started selling weapons to Iran, which is problematic for numerous reasons. One, because it was totally illegal, according to every convention in the world. They were illegally selling weapons to Iran, which they totally recognise. That's documented and admitted to. that they were selling weapons to Iran. What's interesting is that they were also selling weapons to Iraq, which was happening. They were doing it at the same time during the 80s, and they recognised that they were selling weapons to Iran. They recognised that they were selling weapons to Iraq, including biochemical weapons, which we'll talk about today, that were actually used on the Kurds by Saddam Hussein in his own country, because they were more loyal to the Iranians. But what's the key fact? That Iran and Iraq were at war during the 80s, and the Americans were supplying both sides with weapons. That's just a proxy war, that's genocide, that is completely illegal, and is a global scandal of monumental proportions. And it's completely recognised, but no one ever connects the two things. Yes, we were selling weapons to Iran. Yes, we were selling weapons to Iraq, but they never say, yes, we were selling weapons to both. Never mention it in the same sentence. So that's absolutely disgusting, of course. And it was part of the global arms trade, which was completely illegal and shrouded in mystery and lies and deception. And what they were doing was they were selling these weapons to Iran so that they could have the black money. They only want the black money. Then they can use the black money to buy guns and ammunition and fly it down to Nicaragua to overthrow the Sandinista government, which they said was communist. It may have been. But that doesn't give you the right to go kicking other people's doors in and changing the government, which is what they did. And they went down there and they gave weapons to what they called the Contras, which is just a band of, mainly Hondurans, actually, that was formulated by the CIA and trained and funded by the CIA to overthrow the government. And when they took the guns down there to Nicaragua, they thought, well, while we're in Central America, let's load up the plane with cocaine. And they did. And they loaded up the plane with cocaine, and they brought hundreds and hundreds of tons of cocaine back to America. This is the CIA. This is documented, proven fact, for sale on the streets of the United States to generate more money to buy more guns to take them back to Nicaragua. And this was such a problematic process, and it had the potential for so much damage that they actually wanted to enact a procedure called Rex 84, which was basically it was a FEMA initiative, the Federal Emergency Management Authority, and they're supposed to deal with natural disasters. But they have camps, they have FEMA camps where if there's a flood, they can put everyone in the camp. And what they wanted to do was to suspend the Constitution and implement martial law. So no democracy, no Constitution, no human rights, no legal rights, nothing. FEMA takes control of the country. And this was the most serious part for Americans. And it was when they actually televised the hearings, there was one guy, one senator, asking questions about this. What do you mean suspend the Constitution and take control of the country? What's that? And the chairman stopped him from asking the questions. He said, well, we'll have a private chat about this behind closed doors. No, you won't. You'll fucking you'll have a public chat on television where we can see you. So yeah, every time they got any close to anything absolutely, blockbuster level, scandalous, they just went in the back room. I don't know if they talked about it or not, but they certainly didn't talk about it on television. So that's basically the Iran-Contra scandal, which is a lot to look into there. If you can find information on it, be happy, because it is buried. And you say, right, okay, so they're flying all this cocaine in, and then what? What, did they just, drive around in cars trying to sell it? No. They had a special airport called Mena, Arkansas, M-E-N-A, Mena. And the CIA were flying the cocaine into Mena. And they had various other drop points around Mena, but it's arse end of nowhere, rural Arkansas. And that was perfect. You could fly straight in from Central America into Arkansas. It's dirty little airport that in the middle of nowhere, as I say. And this was put in place by Reagan and George Bush Sr. and all that, so that they would have an airport where they could bring all the cocaine in. And this was a full CIA operation. And It was started by Ronald Reagan and George Bush Senior and people like that, people around them. But it was actually taking place in Arkansas. Now, who was the governor of Arkansas at that time? Bill Clinton. So this happened under the watchful eye of Bill Clinton. He knew all about it, right? And he's a Democrat and the other guys are Republicans. That's what I mean. It means nothing, that. It means nothing. It's like having a football team on a Sunday. It doesn't. You don't care whether you're red or blue. You just want to play the game. And that's the same thing with party politics, especially in the United States. So is there money in it? Yeah. Power? Yeah. All right. Let's do it. Let's go. So how did they do it? Well, they needed some help, and they got the help of a guy called Barry Seal. Seal. And who was Barry Seal? Well, Barry Seal was a drug smuggler of monumental proportions. He had his own fleet of planes. His favourite plane that he used for smuggling he called it the Fat Lady. And they were all modified illegally and used for drug smuggling. One of them was actually shot down going into Nicaragua. And the guy was on television and all that. He was caught doing it. And of course, everyone threw him to the wolves. It's just this guy on his own with a plane doing whatever he's doing with cocaine and guns. Nah, it's obviously an international operation. And Barry Seal was a government agent. He worked for the CIA, he worked for the FBI, he worked for the DEA. But he was also a drug smuggler. And he became too public, and then he was shot dead and killed in brutal fashion, apparently by the Colombians, because he was a grass. He was working with the CIA and the DEA, and that's why the Colombians massacred him. I don't know if that's true or not. I think it's more likely that he was put out of the circle by the powers that be in America, and they just said, right, butcher him up and say it was the Colombians. But that's pure opinion on my part. But he was brutally murdered, Barry Seal. And Bill Clinton, as I say, was in charge of the whole state of Arkansas. He totally dominated it. And he had all these people in key positions. Nothing happened in Arkansas without Bill Clinton's approval and knowledge. And when you're flying hundreds of tons of cocaine into Arkansas all the time on a weekly basis, and there's hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of dirty money being generated, what do you do with that money? You can't just declare it. You can't put it in a normal bank. Well, you need mechanisms. And Bill Clinton created a mechanism called ADFA, which was the Arkansas Development and Finance Authority, which was supposed to be giving money to schools and churches, but actually was used as a money laundering mechanism. So they'd give out fake loans and never get any money back, and basically use it to wash all the money that was coming in through the airport at Mina, through the cocaine trade. And they also needed a bank, which we'll look at later, because that's key. What bank did they use? Anyway, they're doing these drops, they're bringing in all this cocaine, and just so we know what page we're on, there was a very famous story in the 80s in America that was known as the Boys on the Tracks, and it was two young lads, 16 and 17, who were found dead on the railway tracks, side by side in identical positions. And the train driver's coming along, he sees these two boys on the tracks, and he puts the brake on. So you've got the lights, you've got the train, you've got the brakes, and the kids don't wake up, and they get hit, by the train, unfortunately. And that was the situation. And the coroner came along, a guy called Fahmy Malak, and said, he was infamous. And he came along and said, oh, well, they smoked 20 marijuana cigarettes each and then fell asleep in identical positions across the railway tracks. And that's why they didn't hear the train coming. What? And this is what he's trying to tell to the parents, and the parents are saying that's just bullshit. So they managed to get a second autopsy. Turns out one of them had been shot, the other one had been stabbed and smashed in the face with a rifle before they went on the tracks. They were dead before they were on the tracks. That's why they didn't move when the train came. Not because they'd been smoking fucking marijuana. And this guy, Fahmy Malak, I mean, one of his best ones, there was a guy who he said had died of an ulcer. Right. And then it turned out his head was missing. And he said, well, the dog ate his head. His dog ate the guy's head. Unfortunately for Fahmy Malak, the head was found a few days later in a bin. So he's just completely lying about it. And this is the guy who's told us that these kids died because they fell asleep after smoking marijuana. What had really happened was they'd seen the drop. They'd gone out there in the woods and they'd seen the cocaine coming down from the planes, low-flying planes, dropping the cocaine. And they'd seen it. And they'd been caught seeing it. They'd seen too much. And it wasn't just them. There was like at least six people around them that were telling people, I know too much about this, they're going to get me. And then they got shotgun blasted. One got shot about 30 times and they threw him on a dump, burnt his body. One got shotgun blasted in the face. Anyone who knew anything about these cocaine drops got murdered. And you can look into the Clinton body count, it's astonishing. And because of that, because Clinton played ball with the powers that be, next thing you know, he goes from governor of Arkansas to the president of the United States of America, because he's in the club now. He can be trusted. And he actually admitted all this, basically. A woman called Sarah McClendon, who was a reporter in the United States. She was in the press pack for 11 different presidencies. And she asked him about this, very directly on television. And he basically admitted that it was in existence and it did happen, but it was nothing to do with him. He literally said, we had nothing to do with it. They didn't tell us anything about it. I don't know what you're talking about. Cocaine, planes, Nicaragua, what do you mean? He admitted that it happened, but it just absolved himself of any responsibility. And he did that on television. So if anyone tries to say it didn't happen, just show them that video of the president admitting that it happened, and then look at all the deaths around it and all the scandal. And, of course, the final little bit that I'll leave in there is how they got rid of it. Look into Rick Ross. Find out who Rick Ross is. Not the rapper. The rapper is using the name of a real criminal. Rick Ross, the rapper, is complete bullshit. He used to work in a prison. He was a prison guard. And he heard the legend of Rick Ross, the real Rick Ross, Freeway Ricky Ross, and stole his name. And then Rick Ross got out of prison and told everybody and embarrassed the rapper. But the real Ricky Ross was Freeway Ricky Ross. Used to make $3 million a day on crack cocaine with the cocaine that was being brought in by the CIA and sold to Ricky Ross by a Nicaraguan called Blandone. And Ricky Ross, from living on the streets, that's why it's called Freeway Ricky Ross, suddenly became a chemist and knew how to mix crack cocaine, which is extremely complex and, was new. And he pioneered it, this street kid. Nonsense. Obviously, was shown how to do that. So where did all the money go? How did he manage all this money, this black money? Through BCCI, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or the Bank of Crooks and Criminals International, as it was colloquially known for many years before the scandal broke. So this is a bank, but it's a criminal entity. It's a criminal organisation. It's a gang. And they were known throughout the world, right, as a criminal organisation. Everybody knew. They started in Pakistan with a guy called Abadi. He was funded through Abu Dhabi. Then they made a connection with the Bank of America. And that gave them some kind of, profile. And now, okay, we've got money from the Middle East. We've got a connection to the Bank of America. Okay, BCCI, come in, do your thing. And it was only when the branch was closed down in London, suddenly they just locked the doors, the authorities went in there and locked the doors, that people started asking questions and millions of people lost all the money around the world with this scandal. And this was a major, major, major event in Parliament in England because it was a crooked bank and everyone knew it. And this is when it came out that, according to experts, the top 3,000 criminal organisations in the world all use the same bank, BCCI. And this is, and the dictators, all your Noriegas and all your terrorist organisations and your Pablo Escobars, they're all using the same bank. And guess who else is using the bank? the White House, and the CIA. Right, so hang on. All these dictators and criminal gangs know which bank to go to. It's not two Indians going up to Medellin and saying, Pablo, why don't you keep your money in our bank? You know, it doesn't work like that. You get your face blown off. Everyone knows where to go, including the CIA. And he said, well, why would the CIA be using the same bank as all these criminal organisations? Well, that's like the young guy walking down the street and he says, Mum, what are you doing on the corner with all these prostitutes? You know, she's a prostitute. Why is the CIA in the room with all these criminal gangs? Because it's a criminal gang. You know, that penny has to drop at some point. These people are criminals and gangsters and killers. And that's why they're using the same bank as Pablo Escobar and Hezbollah and every and any other dark entity in the world, because that's what they are. They're a dark entity and a criminal organisation, the cocaine importation agency, as they are widely known. And so they're up in the mix with all this, with all these, you know, the darkest people in the world, the worst people in the world, and that's exactly what they are. So how was BCCI able to operate? And everyone knew what it was. How was it able to operate? Well, because it had the CIA backing it. It had presidents of countries around the world. And it had a lot of influence in Washington. A lot of what they call lobbyists, which basically means that you hang about in the lobby and then you try and tell somebody what to do and give them some money and all that. So they just had a lot of insidious influence in Washington. Because it was a bank where you can rinse your money and not pay any tax. Thank you very much. So they were very popular in Washington. And they were going in there and they were secretly owning, and they had been for years, the First American Bank. If you watch First American Bank advertisements, it's the most American thing, cheesy American thing you've ever seen in your life. First American. It's actually owned by Pakistanis. You know, you're taking the piss. So, they used that image of First American Bank to seem as American as possible, when in fact it was founded by Pakistanis, funded by Arabs, and was an international bank. They had 400 branches in 78 countries. Just try and name 78 countries. I bet you can't. But they had banks in 78 countries. That is a global criminal organisation, up to the tits in it, with the CIA and everybody else. One guy who knew all this, just so you know, if you ever see any reports about me anywhere, one guy who knew all this that I'm telling you about was a guy called Vince Foster. I've got an annoying habit of holding my bottle like that for 5 minutes, I've noticed it. Vince Foster worked for Bill Clinton, not just in the White House, but in Arkansas as well. When Bill was the governor of Arkansas, he worked at the Rose law firm with Hillary Clinton. He was one of the partners, and so was she. And he was a close boyhood friend of Bill Clinton as well. And he was involved in the MENA airport, operation and scandal, up to his neck in it with Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton and Wooten Epps and all these gang. He had a criminal gang in place. And Vince Foster was part of it. And Vince Foster was also involved in BCCI, that scandal, because Bill Clinton and his mates in Arkansas used BCCI, like every other criminal entity, to wash the money. So Vince Foster was heavily implicated in the BCCI scandal as well. He was also heavily implicated in the Waco tragedy, where the government went in there and burnt the house down, and they killed a lot of kids. And this was given as the reason for what happened, because Vince Foster apparently committed suicide. And the story is, the commonly told story is that Vince Foster felt bad about the kids in the house at Waco, because he was a family man, Vince Foster, and he was known for that. And then he's sitting at his desk, and he thought, I can't live with this Waco thing anymore. So he's got up, he's left, he's gone to a park called Fort Marcy Park, just outside Washington, D.C., and he's gone into the park, into the woods, and he's put a gun in his mouth and blown his own brains out in the afternoon, because he felt so bad about these kids at Waco. Now, only about 300 problems with that, a bit like this chair. You don't get up from your desk and blow your own brains out in a park in the afternoon normally. But there's absolutely zero forensic evidence to suggest that Vince Foster shot himself. No blood on the gun. He's got a gun in his hand, which is nonsense anyway. If you shoot yourself in the mouth like that, the recoil will throw the gun away every time, far as well. It's still in his hand. Bullshit. No blood on the gun. He put it in his mouth and shot himself. Why is there no blood on the gun? No powder on his hands. No blood at the scene. They never found the bullet. He had no mud on his shoes when he's supposed to have walked through the park. The man was clearly dumped in the park. So this is a guy who knows too much. He hasn't committed suicide. He knows too much. He's obviously said the wrong thing to the wrong person. Boom. You've just committed suicide, and we're going to leave you in the park. I mean, it was an obvious murder, but it was so insidious as well, because as soon as he was dead, within an hour of his death being announced, Hillary Clinton's people were in his office ransacking it, and there were many official testimonies to that in Congress, eyewitnesses who saw it happen. Of course, they denied doing it, even though they were seen doing it. And all those documents were shredded. And so they made a bullshit news program about this on 60 Minutes, in which they tried to state it as a fact that Vince Foster committed suicide, and failed miserably. Miserably. He was clearly iced because he knew too much. And when we talk about getting rid of documents, you have to mention the Oklahoma City bombing. So this is all, I'm giving you this more or less in a timeline. But in 1995, we get the Oklahoma City bombing, 2 years to the day after Waco. And the guy who's supposed to have done it, Timothy McVeigh, gave that as his reason. He said the reason that he blew up the Oklahoma City, the Murrah building in Oklahoma City, was because of Waco. It was revenge for Waco, because he couldn't believe that could happen in America. So what's he supposed to have done? He's supposed to have parked a van outside the building, a federal building, filled with ammo, and blown it up. Well, A, you're not parking a fucking rental van outside a federal building, right? And B, there was no ammo. You can see that, because ammo's toxic. And if there's ammo in the air, it's going to burn your lungs out. Could even kill you. And people are just walking around. There's no ammo in the air, so that's a lie as well. And there were bombs inside the building. You can watch the news reports where they're saying that more bombs have been found. They've found another bomb. They've found another bomb inside the building. The bomb squads are going in. And then they just say, no, just one bomb outside, and it was this car bomb. And you look at the damage done to that building. And Manchester was, my city of Manchester was blown up with an ammo bomb. I know what it looks like. It doesn't look like that. Right? It takes the glass out, smashes all the windows. It does not break concrete. It's air. Air can't break concrete like that. It just cannot do that kind of damage. It's called Toussaint's damage or something like that. And it can't be done by air. So anyway, that's bollocks. None of the ATF were in that building, Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms Department. They weren't there. They were warned, don't go in. And they were involved in Waco as well. Don't go in to work today. And then the building got blown up. Right. The first thing they did, the guys in blue jackets with no letters on, was to secure the area and go in there and start picking up documents and files that were sensitive. And they wouldn't allow anyone to even rescue people that were still alive in the rubble, in the building, until those documents were collected. And who had all these documents in there from various scandals like Mina and like Whitewater and all that? Billy Clinton. Because when he went to Washington, all his records that were kept in Arkansas were moved to the Murrah building in Oklahoma randomly. And that's the building that got blown up. I'm not saying Bill Clinton blew it up. But, I mean, the first thing they did was go in and get rid of all the records before they'd even save people's lives. They could die. You stay there and die until we've got these papers. Absolutely crazy. So Timothy McVeigh, who was that? He was a guy, he was an ex-military man. He was a soldier, prolific soldier actually, a total American patriot who apparently just left the army, even though that story's full of holes, and went to live in a place called Elohim City, which was full of domestic terrorists, people that wanted to attack the government. But it was totally infiltrated with agents. Every second person in Elohim City was a CIA agent or a DEA agent, and they've all given testimony about it. You know, it's not a secret that they were there, but there were so many of them there. And Timothy McVeigh had always said that he was an undercover Black Ops agent, so I don't know. Was he involved in it? Did they use him? But the story is that it was just one guy, as always. It's always just one guy. Well, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is that there are many eyewitnesses to the fact that he wasn't on his own. He was in the van with another guy. He was seen by like 27 different eyewitnesses that were totally disconnected from each other. All said, yeah, he was with this guy, and described the same guy. And that guy was known in the media as John Doe 2. So they launched the biggest manhunt in American history to look for this guy, John Doe 2. Spent something like $10 million on the search for this guy. And then after searching for him for a while, they said, oh yeah, he doesn't actually exist. Well, what about the 27 eyewitnesses that described him exactly the same, including his tattoo that he had on his forearm of a snake? All of them literally said he had a tattoo of a snake on his forearm. All these 27 people completely imagined this big stocky guy with a snake tattoo on his arm. Doesn't exist. Why did you spend millions looking for him? Don't know, doesn't exist. Shut up, go away. And part of the bullshit that they needed to bring out to reinforce this nonsense narrative was that all of the cameras, again, just like with Princess Diana, which is another thing, all of the cameras stopped working. Then that was proven to be nonsense. So they said, oh, well, we've got the tapes, but you can't see them. Then it was, why not? It's a public building. We pay for those cameras. We've lost the tapes. I mean, just lie after lie after lie to cover up the fact that more than one person was involved. In fact, they even made a film called Arlington Road with Tim Robbins and Jeff Bridges about this, about the fact that one guy at the end of the film, it's a spoiler, but one guy gets tricked into blowing up a building, but it's actually a network of people behind him who do that professionally. Really good film, brilliant film, and it's based on this. Absolutely clearly based on this. And a couple of people who knew too much in this case were Terence Wakey and Jesse Trenadu. Totally disconnected people in every way. Terence Wakey was a cop, big black fella, and he was there on the day of Oklahoma City bombing. And he was a hero. He kept running in and dragging people out of the rubble, saving people's lives. And he started saying the wrong things, asking the wrong questions. And he started getting death threats and all this kind of stuff. Harassment. He was being followed everywhere. And this is a cop. He was a hero. He saved many people's lives on the day. But that wasn't good enough. He was a problem. And his wife was threatened, and his kids were threatened, and everything was threatened. And then one day, Terence Wakey says to his mate, he's supposed to be meeting his mate for lunch, and he says, well, look, I've got these feds following me. I just want to go and leave some documents in a safe, basically, in one of these lockers, you know. And then I'll lose the feds, which obviously he felt able to do because he was a cop, I suppose. I'll lose the feds, and then I'll come and meet you for lunch. Never came back. He was gone. This chair was probably the most annoying chair in the world. So Terence Wakey, he goes and apparently leaves these documents wherever he's going, and he's got the feds up his ass. And he never comes back. And this is the suicide, right, that Terence Wakey apparently did. This is the official story, right? Wikipedia will tell you this. He committed suicide by sitting in his car, beating himself repeatedly for ages, punching himself, hitting himself with a bat or something. He was absolutely full of bruises and contusions and cuts. He's just battered himself. Then he's got a knife. At some point, he's actually handcuffed himself. They have massive handcuff marks. At some point, he's handcuffed himself and probably done this or something to get those marks on his wrist. Then he's unhandcuffed himself so he can get a knife and start stabbing himself. He stabbed himself like 13 times, including in the neck. Then he's got out of the car, but he's got his gun first, you see. So he put the knife down and got the gun out. Then he's got out of his car, leaving his keys in the ignition. He's got out of the car, closed the door, locked it without the key. Maybe it locked without the key, fair enough. But don't forget to lock the car before you go and blow your brains out. And he's now bleeding profusely. He's stabbed himself 13 times. He's been beating himself for the last half an hour with a baseball bat or whatever. And don't forget, he's anemic. So it's medically impossible for him to continue walking. He's anemic. He would have just bled out. He would have been unconscious in seconds. But no, he walks half a mile across rough terrain through fields with the gun, finds himself a nice little tree, sits down next to the tree, bang, murders himself, and manages to hide the gun. So after he's already dead, he then hides the gun. I've got problems with that. And that's literally the case. Again, the same with Vince Foster. He's managed to shoot himself in the mouth without getting any blood on the gun. And, that nobody ever finds the bullet. This guy's dead in a field now. He's apparently tortured himself and then shot himself and then managed to find a way to hide the gun in a field after he's dead. I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous. And this was a cop. He was a hero who saved lives on the day of the event, who was then clearly murdered because he was asking the wrong questions and saying the wrong things. And there's another guy who didn't witness anything, Jesse Trenadu. His big mistake was looking like the picture of the John Doe that they then said didn't exist, John Doe 2. They said he didn't exist. And Jesse Trenadu had a snake tattoo on his forearm. And he looked similar, very similar to the pictures and the eyewitness accounts. So he's picked up for parole violation and he's flown out to Oklahoma, miles from where he lived. And they put him in a kind of a prison transit centre. And he commits suicide all of a sudden, Jesse Trenadu. Commits suicide, right. Not suicidal at all, not that kind of person. No reason to commit suicide. He's a very happy man. But he suddenly commits suicide. And how does he do it? Well, he does it by torturing himself. He took the family had to fight to get the body back. They wanted to incinerate the body, but the Oklahoma state governors wouldn't let them do it. It's against the law in Oklahoma to do that. But the federal government wanted to cremate him immediately, but they weren't able to. So the family got the body back, and it was full of bruises. His skull was cracked, all his bones were broken. They'd been beating him on the bottom of the feet, which is standard torture. His body was full of Coca-Cola, which they used to enhance the pain in torture because of the caffeine. Apparently, it makes everything hurt more. And this is the way that they say that he killed himself, by beating himself to death and torturing himself. And even though he's in a prison cell, managing to drink litres of Coca-Cola, which I don't really think you can get in prison anyway. I mean, it's just ridiculous. They beat him to death, and the brother of Jesse Trenadu got a phone call from Timothy McVeigh saying, "Your brother's been killed. It was the FBI. It was an interrogation gone wrong. They thought it was this guy, this John Doe 2, and they beat him to death. I'm very sorry." And that's what happened. And even when they went into his cell 6 months later and they did the line, what's it called? The chemical that makes blood, luminol, that makes blood shine. So it lit up like a Christmas tree when they went in his cell 6 months later. So he was clearly murdered. And this is all to cover up the Oklahoma City bombing, which is shady to say the least, and where lots of documents were basically found and confiscated while people were left dying in the rubble. That takes us perfectly to Building 7, 9/11. Yes, I'm going there. What's the problem with Building 7? Well, mainly that most people in the world don't even know what Building 7 is. It's the Solomon Brothers building in New York. So we know that on September 11th, 2001, a couple of planes flew into the Twin Towers. Massive tragedy, 3,000 deaths approximately. People are still dying from that because of the cancers that came from the pyroclastic flow of the buildings when they fell. Real bad tragedy. I'll admit straight away, I don't know who did it. you're forced to choose between some guy in a cave in Afghanistan or George Bush. I don't believe either. I don't really know. I don't know who did it, but those buildings came down, in my opinion, very, very strong opinion, in a controlled demolition. No tower, no buildings like that have ever collapsed in history due to fire or impact. Never. It's never happened before, and it's never happened since. Happened 3 times in one day. And the first 2 buildings, they were hit by planes at least. Building 7 was never hit by a plane. And it was a 47-story skyscraper. This is a big building. And there was a fire on one floor, really. An office fire. And the building collapsed because of an office fire. It didn't just burn up some chairs and leave the walls all black. No. It caused the building to collapse into its own footprint, which is scientifically impossible. Right? The only way you can do that, and it actually achieved free fall, which according to Isaac Newton's laws of gravity is impossible, because you have to take out all the resistance below it in order for it to free fall. There's nothing under it. The only way to achieve that is to detonate charges on the pillars at the same time to take all the pillars out. That's why there's no resistance, so it can just fall like a tennis ball in a vacuum, like that. Vroom. That is impossible. Fires don't do that to buildings, but they do 3 times in one day for some reason in New York. And NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology in America, they were hired basically to do a report on these events. And it took 6 years, or maybe 7 years, to come back and give a report of the events which didn't even mention Building 7. Didn't even mention a 47-story skyscraper collapsing into its own footprint in 6 seconds in the middle of New York. Do you think you might want to mention that bit? So you've got 2 towers here, so they talk about that, but they don't mention the other one that collapsed over here. And that's why most people that you talk to, you say Building 7, they don't even know what you're talking about. Because it doesn't fit the narrative. No planes hit it. Why did it collapse? We're going to have to change the regulations for firefighting worldwide. Because if office fires can cause a building to collapse into its own footprint, you can't send firefighters into a building to fight a fire, because we know that the whole thing can just collapse like a pancake at any minute and do it in 6 seconds. And we also know apparently that Isaac Newton was completely wrong. Isaac Newton was full of shit, because, you know, the laws of gravity don't work apparently. Well, of course they do work. It was a controlled demolition. And what you have to remember about that is it takes a long time to prepare a controlled demolition like that. You don't do that in a couple of minutes. That takes weeks, even months. Who had access to that building? Look at who was in the building. The CIA, FBI, everyone had office in there. It was what we call an alphabet soup. How are some Saudis and Afghans or whatever going to get in and out of that building every day to place those charges so they can detonate the building and bring it down? It's just not feasible. Somebody did it. I don't know who it was. It wasn't George Bush. Somebody did it, but it wasn't some half illiterate guys from Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan walking in and out of the building with explosive devices every day. That's just bullshit. That's clearly bullshit. So I don't know who did it, but I do know that the BBC knew it was going to happen before it happened, because they reported it live. It went live 40 minutes before the building collapsed. The BBC were telling us all, Building 7 has also collapsed, the Solomon Brothers building collapsed a few minutes ago. And the woman's saying it, and the building's still behind her. It hasn't collapsed yet. It's there, perfectly solid, nothing wrong with it. I mean, it had a fire in it, but it's not going to collapse. There's no indication it's going to collapse. And she's on television talking about the collapse before it even happened. I think someone's gone off script. Maybe the time difference, I don't know. But they've got the script saying Building 7 collapsed, and she's reading it. She's saying, oh yeah, Building 7 collapsed. It's behind you, love. Turn round and have a look. It's a big 47-story building. So why are the BBC saying that a building has collapsed before it collapsed and then it collapses? If it's a mistake, it's a mistake. The building doesn't collapse. It hasn't collapsed, whatever. But if you go on television and say it's collapsed and then 40 minutes later it collapses, You've got some questions to answer, but never asked. She has never been asked. The BBC have never addressed that, and they've even been taken to court. Who told you that that building collapsed? Come on, you've put it on television. Who told you that? You're the British Broadcasting Corporation. You're not a private company. Who gave you that information? And it's called Reuters. No, Reuters is a news agency. Where did they get it from? What's the source of that information that that building collapsed? Don't ask that. Conspiracy theory. By the way, put options, what are they? A put option is when you think that the stock of a company, the value of a company is going to go down. So call options is a standard one where you think, right, this is going to be a good month for Microsoft because they've got a new product. So I'm going to basically bet on Microsoft on the stocks going up, and when they do, I'll make money. A put option is the opposite. It's when you think that the value of a company is going to go down, and you basically bet on that. And when the stocks go down, when the values go down, you can make a lot of money. It's called a put bet or a put option. The airlines that were involved in 9/11, the planes that were hijacked from those American Airlines was one. Those airlines that were actually hijacked, there was an incredible quantity of put betting going against those companies just prior to 9/11. It's something, like 500% or some crazy number. It's up, massive amount of put betting going on these exact airlines that were involved in 9/11 before 9/11 happened. People knew that was going to happen. And the investigation that didn't really do anything, they said, well, we couldn't really connect those put bets to Osama bin Laden. Right, well, who do you connect them to then? Connect them to somebody and tell us who it was, because they knew that 9/11 was going to happen. And they said the issue of financing 9/11 was of little practical significance. Who paid for it was not important. It's not important who paid for it. It's not important who knew it was going to happen, who was betting on it before it happened. And there's actually about $4 million unclaimed dollars because somebody's bet on that and they don't want to go and say, yeah, I knew 9/11 was going to happen. That's why I bet on it. Give me my money. And of course, when the building went down, a lot of evidence was destroyed, just like in the Oklahoma City bombing, because the place was absolutely full of documentation from various different investigations. And when the building went, all the evidence went with it. So after 9/11, very shortly after 9/11 actually, we got some letters sent to various people in positions of authority and power in the United States. The only problem with the letters was that they were caked in anthrax. This was the anthrax letters scandal situation, call it what you want. It was people receiving letters with anthrax in them. And, I think 5 people died. A lot of people were seriously injured. This is a chemical weapon. It's a biochemical weapon. It's a biological weapon, anthrax. Naturally occurring as a biological weapon. And that's a very serious thing. That's murder, And the problem with it was that it was highly sophisticated. This anthrax, you don't just make it in your kitchen. It was military grade, and not just military grade. It was beyond that. And they said that it was a guy called Bruce Ivins, or Ivins, I've heard it pronounced both ways. And he was just this one guy. It's always one guy, one guy who was upset for some stupid reason and decided to make military grade anthrax. He was a biochemist, and he did work at Fort Detrick. But they said, well, he was pissed off for his own reasons, and he made this anthrax, and he put it in his letters, and he sent it to these people, and then he committed suicide. So once again, it was one guy, but you can't ask him about it because he's dead. I mean, come on. And he's not the only one just connected with this who's dead in absolutely ridiculous circumstances. And the problem is that to make that kind of anthrax, you need a team of the most expert people in the world, and you need incredible machinery. You have to refine those anthrax spores. And there are only 3 or 4 places in the world that can be done, and Fort Detrick is not one of them. So it was impossible for Bruce Ivins to have done that. It's literally not scientifically possible with the equipment that he had on his own. No way. And that's not me saying that. That's the top experts in the world saying not possible. There are other places that could possibly do it, like Porton Down in England, but not Fort Detrick. No way. So who actually did it, and why is Bruce Ivins dead? Good questions. Well, there are other deaths to consider, but this was part when people started looking into this and saying, right, who can actually make this kind of anthrax? And they're looking at other places in America, and they're looking at places in Canada, they're looking at Porton Down in England, and they started to realise that there was an international black market for biochemical weapons that went everywhere around the world. And you know, I mean, the Americans acknowledged selling biochemical weapons to Saddam Hussein that he then used to kill the Kurds in his own country. You know, so this biochemical weapon industry is a massive, massive underground black market that goes all around the world, including South Africa. So during the apartheid regime, right, the white government really wanted to annihilate the black people of the country. There's just no other way of looking at it. And they came upon the idea of biochemical weapons. And this was part of something called Project Coast. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to attack the black women in South Africa with a chemical weapon or a biological weapon that would make them infertile and unable to have children. How evil is that? It would sterilize the black women without them even knowing it. You know, and then they're trying to have families and they can't because they've been sterilized by the government. And the South Africans didn't have the technology to do that, but they were part of the international biochemicals black market, which included the United States and included the United Kingdom. And everybody was up to the nuts in this. Especially United Kingdom and especially Porton Down. And who was the top boss at Porton Down? Dr. David Kelly. Dr. David Kelly is famous because he was a weapons inspector in Iraq during the whole weapons of mass destruction bullshitterama, where Saddam Hussein could launch nuclear strikes against anybody in the world in less than 40 minutes. And it was Dr. David Kelly, who was the chief weapons inspector in Iraq, who went to a journalist and said, this is lies. This is absolute lies. I'm in there all the time. You need massive installations for that. It's not something you can hide under a table. You need enormous factories and plants and to produce nuclear weapons or even nuclear power, much less weaponize that nuclear power. So Dr. David Kelly became famous for that because he was identified as the source of that story when the big scandal came out that Tony Blair was lying and presenting lies to the people and lies to the parliament in order to justify joining the Americans in an attack on Iraq. And that was a bad enough scandal in itself. And that's what made him famous. But he was also the chief of biochemistry, defence, weaponry at Porton Down. Top boy, and right involved in the biochemistry industry. And this is a man who certainly knew too much. And then after this scandal, he decided to walk out into a field, take a load of tablets, even though he had an aversion to tablets. He couldn't swallow them. Everybody knew this. And then he decided to start slashing his own wrists. But I suppose they didn't know that he had a problem with his elbow and couldn't really do that kind of thing. He had very limited mobility in his arm. And he wouldn't die from those cuts anyway. And this is testified to by experts. That won't kill you. You'll bleed for half an hour, but it won't kill you. No way. And he was found by joggers. I think they were just walking, actually. But they were out in a field with the dog, maybe. And they found him, they found him against a tree. Right? He's got his shoulders and his head against a tree, and he looks dead. So they've called the authorities. And then it later transpires in the official report, they've got him lying down on the floor, not even touching the tree, and said, this is how we found him. And so, of course, this couple went to the media and said, that's not true. He wasn't like that. Somebody's moved him. and they've just been studiously ignored. So, I mean, there are plenty of groups of experts, of doctors, who are campaigning for a real investigation into Dr. David Kelly's death. So there you've got two biochemists who were heavily involved in the biochemical black market, who were both clearly killed. I mean, Bruce Evans, did he commit suicide? I doubt it, because he was the guy that they decided to blame for these attacks. And David Kelly, did he kill himself? I very much doubt it. This was a weapons inspector. He used to going into Iraq. If anyone can handle the pressure of anything, it's Dr. David Kelly. And it's all connected back to Dr. Frank Olson. Who was he? He was a guy, he was a biochemist in the 1950s working with the same people doing the same things. And there is a full series of documentaries about this on Netflix, right? We're even in Netflix territory. And the official story is that Dr. Frank Olson, who was involved in all the same kinds of things, he was given LSD by somebody in the CIA, and then 9 days later, he just randomly ran and dived through a window and fell to his death. 9 days after getting given in his drink, they put LSD in his drink. 9 days later, he gets up and runs and dives through the window face first, and falls to his death. And his son at the time said, "This is absolute bullshit. They've clearly thrown him out the window because he wants to leave. He doesn't want to play the game anymore. So they've murdered him. They've chucked him out the window, obviously." And even the autopsy concluded that he'd been smashed in the head before he went through the window. And this is all documented on Netflix, right? It's documented. So between the Iran-Contra, where you've got all these weapons and all this cocaine, and it's coming into MENA, and it's being washed through, the money's being washed through ADFA and the BCCI. It's a global banking criminal network. All this is known by Vince Foster, who suddenly goes and blows his own head off in a park under totally impossible circumstances. And then all records for many of these things are destroyed in the Oklahoma City bombing, which is absolute bullshit from start to finish. Then Building 7 goes down with similar effects, scientifically impossible and happening in front of your eyes. And then right after that, we get these anthrax letters, which open a whole can of worms about international biochemical black markets. So remember, what I'm saying is that I'll leave you with this. It's called the Underworld. It's not called the Undertown. You know, it's a whole world that operates beneath the surface. And if you imagine it like you're standing on a boat on the ocean and you can't see the fish, that doesn't mean there are no fish. There are millions of fish, right? You have to dive in. And it's the same thing with information. Don't go to Wikipedia. They are full of shit. Come to the Power Hour and find out what's really going on. Brilliant from me, brilliant from you, brilliant from Omar with his technological advances, and brilliant from Johnny Spence. I'll see you next time on the Power Hour.